What's the good about it? I get to work in movies. I get to, facilitate folks' dreams. It is brilliant. I skip to work every day. Sometimes I hobble, but most of the time I'm skipping to work. I really am. Because I spend my days, and pretty much every day, sitting in a conference room, and I got to get dragged out of there, hearing somebody's dream about making their movie. And what I get to bring to the table, I get to be the sober guy at the table, which is, sort of preposterous. Because, it really is necessary when you're combining the arts with the money that has, that somebody sort of interface between the two, that can kind of talk the artist talk, that can kind of talk the financier talk. And I get to be that person, firmly stuck in the middle, and I love it, So what's good about it? Everything's good. I've loved film since I'm a kid, and that I get to be in the thick of working on 25, 30 movies a year, the angels are singing. They passed this tax legislation to bring more films to New York, this tax incentive program, which boosted the tax incentive from 10 state and 5 city to 35%, to 30 and 5. Excuse me, 25 and 10. So 25 on the state and 10 on the city. Now they funded it for a period of 5 years at $515 million, which everyone thought, well, that's enough for 5 years. It lasted 10 months. Which is terrific in that, wow, look at all the films that came to New York. And it ended up generating something like $2.7 or $2.9 billion in taxable revenues. Forgive my caveman math, but 515 million, 2.7 billion, and one of these numbers is bigger than the other. So now we're at the point that nobody really figured out what to do when the money runs out. And the way it works here in New York is you actually get pre-certified by the state. You go in with your budget and you say, here's my budget. And they say, okay, we're pre-certifying you for X dollars. And we're putting that money in the lockbox. And then you can go out there and get third parties to monetize the value of this tax credit. And that's often an integral component of your financial structure. You may have this amount of equity. Maybe you've got some pre-sales, unlikely in this world. And then you've got a debt component. And you've got somebody monetizing your tax credits, which could be, it's 35%, discounted a little bit, they're giving you 82 cents, 78 cents in the dollar. So I got $1 million film going right now where the tax credits are worth about $200,000. The tax credit financiers, and there's not many of them around, particularly in New York because we make it a little bit complicated here, are saying, well, what are we supposed to do now? You got pre-certified for a certain amount of money, but no one knows the answer to what happens when the films higher in the list than you that are already earmarked for their money incur overages, because they're still entitled to their tax credits on the overages they incur, and I don't know, most films go over. It's just the way of the world. So nobody seems to know what happens when the 300 films ahead of you, 75% of them go into overages and end up tapping into that limited pool of $515 million. And at the end of the day, they come down to you and there's just no money left. Because nobody, figured out, well, what do we do? Do we cut these folks off on their overages, tax credits on their overages? It's just a mess, and nobody has any answers, and people are scared, to monetize the tax credit monies, and it's really, the things are kind of upside down right now. In April, the legislation will come back up. They're going to refinance it. It's going to be over $1 billion. I am speaking completely out of my tush, but they have to, because the idea in this economy of sending jobs away is ridiculous. And it also completely defeats my dream, which is to shoot a film entirely in New York that's set in Toronto. I am determined to do that. A lot of people will come in and, to my office and say, I want to start a production company. And I'm never certain what that means. If they mean I want to start a limited liability company or a corporation, I'll tell you what it takes. For a corporation, $300 in about 48 hours. Done. You got a corporation. Congratulations. What are you going to do with it? Other than file a tax return every year, regardless of whether you have revenues, and you're paying the minimum franchise tax, you're spending $400 or $500 a year on taxes for generating no revenues, and you're paying an accountant to do it, and then a year and a half later you're looking around saying, why is it that I have a production company? And you're spending another $1,500 to dissolve the company. Same thing with an LLC, except it's a lot more expensive. There's a publication requirement in the state of New York. The filing fee is the same, but you also have to publish notification of the formation of a limited liability company in 2 different periodicals for 6 weeks, and that costs you an extra $1,500. So, in my opinion, there's no reason to start your own production entity. By that I mean a formal entity that you're paying taxes on, that you're spending the filing fees on, that you're paying a lawyer on potentially, unless there's a reason to do it. And those reasons are you're raising money, okay? And you're, in the case of an individual film, you're setting up what we call a single-purpose production entity. that is dedicated entirely to the one single production, because you don't want to expose that production to outside liabilities. Okay, and when you're raising the money, you want to preserve yourself from liability, and you also want to protect your investors. So even in the case of folks coming in saying, I'm ready to make this movie, the only thing standing between me and making it is, the budget's $3 million. The only thing standing between us is $3 million. And it's like, okay, there's no reason to incur those costs at this point until you know you've got a legitimate investor online, or a development funds investor, or you're entering into a contract, maybe with like a casting director, or, so there really are certain occasions when it makes sense to set up a company, and many, many, many other occasions when it doesn't make sense. In that case, regardless of whether it's you individually, or your team, or a third-party production company, if they know what they're doing, and this is extremely basic, they're going to be setting up a single-purpose entity to produce the film. Even in the case of studio films, Titanic, the copyright holder and the production entity was Titanic LLC. It wasn't 20th Century Fox. So everyone's setting up, these individual production entities, again, to preserve liability, and because these entities are then paying out, in a perfect world, profit participations. They're entering into hundreds and hundreds of agreements with third parties. So you just need to preserve that in one specific entity. There's nothing wrong with aligning yourself with a production entity, particularly if they are more experienced than you in certain aspects, or have the sort of wherewithal or stature in the industry that they can take the film to the next level, whether it be on the distribution side, or bringing in vendors because they have vendor relationships, or perhaps they have more experience in negotiating talent deals. You may have the relationships, but they may have the wherewithal to have to deal with the agents and the lawyers and the managers and all the other gatekeepers in order to actually close a deal. So once you set up that single-purpose entity to produce a film, that entity is managed by one or more parties. So if you're aligning yourself in a co-production arrangement with a third-party production entity, you can actually be a manager of that single-purpose entity with the third-party production company, if you're following what I'm saying. So you can actually still have control over the entity you set up, the single-purpose entity, and still preserve your rights. I mean, you should be very careful. Everyone should be very careful about, entering into option or purchase agreements with respect to your material, without having, a lawyer or someone resembling a lawyer review it, because it gets a little bit tricky, and it's not simply just pro forma stuff that you can get out of, online from Mark Litwack. I mean, the stuff gets a little bit tricky. So we got to be very careful. And I would say the same thing if you're optioning someone else's property. I truly, and if you talk to any of my clients, I believe in fair deals. It doesn't mean I'm not a zealous advocate, but, I'm 20 years in the business, and I'm standing here not feeling like I ever screwed anybody. So I'm not an overzealous advocate. I'm not someone that's just going after the throat and going for blood. I really believe in the fairness of a deal. I'm not a big fan of the dollar options, and I represent a lot of producers. The idea of a producer who acquires the rights in 22 different scripts for $1, to me, is reprehensible. If what's going on is they're just acquiring a bunch of properties, throwing a bunch of stuff against the wall and hoping one of them sticks, because to me, it's not just a piece of paper. Every single one of these options represents somebody's dream, somebody that spent, 3 years, 5 years, 6 weeks, their entire life putting together this screenplay. Not so a producer can come along, give them $1 and put it on a shelf for 5 years or 18 months or whatever it happens to be, So I don't really play that game. I'm not saying if there's not a meeting of the minds and the two parties, the writer and the producer, or the writer and the director, or, whatever a combination of those parties are sort of, partners together. I mean, that dollar option scenario is different than, some wide-eyed kid that's, that wrote a script and doesn't have any idea about the industry, and they're, basically giving everything they have to someone for a nickel. That doesn't make sense to me.